Good morning. Can you all hear me? Good morning. I'd like to begin this morning, as I have the last few weeks, by calling to mind and praying for the enormous pain and suffering that has been caused by Judeo-Christian conflict over the years, since the time we're talking about just now. And certainly we see it happening in our very lifetime, these very weeks. And I sincerely hope that we will, by understanding our common origins and the fact that we worship the same God, we'll begin to understand each other a little better and perhaps give each other a little more leeway in our straying from the straight and narrow path of belief. With that, I'm going to go ahead and begin with a quick comment about last week and really to set the stage for this week. We finished last week talking a little bit about what the Gospels tell us about the what Jesus did to found Christianity, whether or not he founded a new religion, whether he founded churches, etc. And because I did that using the Gospels as my sources, we necessarily ended up close to 100 years after the birth of Christ last week. Because the last gospel that we talked about, the Gospel of John, probably was not in existence much before that time, according to modern philological techniques and study. And so we've sort of jumped ahead to 100. And this morning, we're going to drop back, because this morning I'm going to talk a little bit about what Paul did. And of course, some of you may be aware of the fact that I have had occasion to deliver some lectures on Paul before. And when I've done it in a secular environment, the first time I did it for Florida Gulf Coast University, they changed the title of my talks. I provided them with the title of the Life, Times, and Letters of Paul the Apostle, and they took those words, but then they added below it a paraphrase that said, did Paul invent Christianity? Of course, setting a very, very different tone for the whole set of lectures. It is quite clear that Paul was instrumental in forming so much of Christianity as we see it today. But of course, we can recognize as believers that Paul was, of course, inspired by the Spirit. And of course, in his own words, he tells us that Jesus appeared to him on many occasions after his conversion, and that he calls himself an apostle, not through succession to the original 12, but because of his special relationship with Jesus after his conversion. And so I think it's safe to say, in fact, I know it's safe to say, that whatever changes and issues may have been introduced into the church by Paul's ministry, they certainly were of one fabric with that of the preaching of Jesus during his lifetime. And so there really isn't a dichotomy here. It's just something that secular people like to pose because it makes things a little more interesting, they think. Okay, let's go back to Paul very, very briefly. We all know so much about Paul. In fact, we know probably more about Paul than any other figure in the Christian Bible, mainly because we have two discrete and beautiful sources for his life, his own letters, which were carefully copied by the churches to whom he sent them, and ultimately collected into a volume of his letters. Incidentally, I was going to say this later, but I'll make it in the comment now. Some of you will remember that there is a very, very short letter toward the end of the Pauline canon in the New Testament, the letter to Philemon. If you read that letter, which is one page in most Bibles, you will discover that there is an individual named in that letter, and the name is Onesimus, Onesimus. And Paul describes Onesimus as a fugitive slave who has attached himself to Paul and worked with Paul for some time. And Paul is sending this slave back to his master, Philemon. Well, lo and behold, the oldest copy of the collected letters of Paul that we have is attributed to a bishop by the name of Onesimus from the end of the first century. It's not a very common Roman name, not a very common slave name, and many, of course, suggest, therefore, that Onesimus was one of the people who was instrumental in collecting Paul's letters. But at any rate, we do have a great source of Paul's life. And then, of course, we have the Acts of the Apostles. And the last chapters, after the first 9, are all about the mission of Paul. And this has, of course, provided enormous literature for scholarship in comparing what Paul says about himself and what Luke says about Paul in the Acts of the Apostles. Now, I said we were going to be dropping back, that at the end of last week, we were close to 100 in the history of Christianity. We're going to go all the way back now, because quite likely, Paul was a contemporary of Jesus. And if we read the letters of Paul carefully, and a very, very well-known Dominican scholar by the name of Jerome Murphy O'Connor, who died a few years ago, a professor at the École Biblique in Jerusalem, he has put together a very, very comprehensive life of Paul. And he's noted in his biography of Paul that Paul very, very carefully draws parallels between his own experience and life and that of Jesus. And so we have the situation where we believe that Paul and Jesus were probably born within a year or two of each other. And the beginning of Paul's ministry probably occurred within a year or two after the crucifixion. And therefore, we have this early life of Paul. The early life, of course, is the notorious life that he keeps referring to himself. We know he was, we believe he was raised in Tarsus, a free Greco-Roman city in Turkey, and that he went to the Greek gymnasium, which was the school for the children of patricians in that region. And we propose that he did that mainly for two reasons. One, Paul's Greek, the Greek he uses in the production of his letters, is by far the best and most intellectual Greek in the New Testament. And he would have learned that in a school like the gymnasium. And the argumentative technique that he uses in his letters very, very closely parallels the way boys were taught in the gymnasium. We don't know which of the schools he went to, but those two factors together convince us that he was therefore schooled very, very well in the Greek classics, and therefore had a very good Greek secular education. It would have been common at that time for Jewish parents, and Paul tells us, of course, that his father was a Pharisee and a member of the tribe of Benjamin, a Jew among Jews. Those of you who heard Nicholas this morning's talked about the revolt in Galilee in about 10 years before the birth of Christ. that was a horrific war, and there was an enormous exile of Jews from Galilee at that time. And many of those Jews went to Tarsus as slaves. And therefore, scholars suggest to us that Paul's family ended up in Tarsus as slaves. Under the rules of the Roman Empire at that time, for good behavior, they would have been released from slavehood after 7 years, and they probably stayed in a Jewish diaspora community in Tarsus at that time. But that community was very, very cautious about wanting to ensure that their sons were Jews and not Greeks. And therefore, when they were about 12 or 13, if the family had enough money, they would attach their son to a noted rabbi in Jerusalem. And the boy would spend anywhere from 4 to 6 years learning the Torah and becoming a good Jew. We believe that Paul probably went through that process. Certainly, the quotations that Paul uses in his letters of the Hebrew Bible are flawless. There's no question whatsoever that he had a thorough and complete understanding of the books of the Hebrew Bible by the time he was writing his letters. So we think that Paul's family came from Galilee. That sounds familiar, doesn't it? That he spent his early years in Tarsus, and that he returned to Jerusalem as a young boy. He probably never left Jerusalem at that time. Paul tells us that he became a Pharisee. You will recall that there are only 2 individuals in the Christian Bible who specifically are called Pharisees by name, and Paul is one of them, the other being Nicodemus in the Gospel of John. There are only 2 individuals we could actually say were Pharisees. I'm not going to go back through who the Pharisees were. We talked a little bit about that a couple of weeks ago. But Paul, of course, tells us in his letter that he was a very good Pharisee, a Pharisee among Pharisees. And it was a popular belief among the Pharisees at that time was that the Messiah would bring about the new kingdom of Israel, would throw off the yoke of Roman rule and bring about the kingdom of God on earth. But there was a precondition to that, and that was that the chosen people, had to unite behind a Messiah figure. Paul apparently was convinced that Jesus was not that figure, and he was very fearful that the kingdom of God could not be restored to the city of David as so long as Jesus's followers were preaching and moving about in the kingdom of Israel. We know that Paul was a confused young man. You can imagine. Just think if you were raised in one environment for 13 or 14 years and expected to conform to the lifestyle, the philosophy, and the beliefs of those around you in order to fit in. And then suddenly at the age of 13 or 14, you were uprooted, placed in an entirely different environment with a different language and an entirely different philosophy. He therefore had a split personality, we would say today, in that he wasn't sure where he was. There were a couple of instances that clash. Of course, Judaism, as Christianity, is monotheistic. There is only one God. The Greeks, like the Romans, were pantheistic. There were hundreds of gods. There was a god for every day, a god for every activity, a god for every temple in the Roman Empire. A huge difference in belief system. Then we had the fact that the Greco-Roman world was, until the time of Augustus, a proto-democracy. We all learned in school about how the Greek environment was very much a bottom-up governing system. Of course, the Roman Empire changed that and turned it into an empire. But Semitism, Judaism, was built on the concept of a monarch who was a representative of God on earth, who was the chief priest as well as the chief political leader, a top-down kind of environment. The Greco-Roman world was very, very much by this time an urbanized world. People lived in cities, whereas the Jews were still shepherds and farmers living in the countryside. And perhaps most importantly for many of us today, the Greeks were beginning to liberate women. Men who died and left widows allowed, the society allowed those women to inherit their homes and their businesses. And as a consequence, by the middle of the first century, we begin to see a significant number of women homeowners and entrepreneurs in the Greco-Roman world, not in Judaism. Just imagine what that means to Paul, who is in his young adult life, is being raised in a patriarchal society. He converts and goes on mission, and he finds himself almost entirely dependent upon women who like his message, who host him in their homes, and begin house churches in their homes. Just imagine how that would have impacted his thinking. We know that Paul went to Antioch. He tells us he went to Antioch after his conversion. I won't go into the details of his conversion. We've all heard that story many times. But he goes to Antioch and he searches out a diaspora community in Antioch. Antioch at that time was one of the principal cities of the Roman Empire. It later became one of the 5 principal cities of the Christian Roman Empire. You may remember there were 5 patriarchs, and they were in Rome, Jerusalem, Antioch, Alexandria, and Constantinople. So Antioch was one of the 5 principal centers of early Christianity at the time. There were most likely groups of Christians living together. The style of life is described in the Acts of the Apostles by Luke. The Christians lived together, typically in condominium/apartment complexes with common eating and cooking facilities and separate sleeping rooms for the families. Very, very much what we would today call communist or communal environment. So Paul searches out Antioch, and he presents himself as an apostle of Jesus. The Jewish Christians of Antioch are a little suspicious of him. Needless to say, this guy who has been a self-proclaimed persecutor of Christians appears and says, well, I've turned over a new leaf and I want to become your representative around this area. We know that the people of Antioch were very suspicious because the first 2 major missions of Paul, which are described both in the Acts of the Apostle and in Paul's letters, were with Barnabas, a missionary from Antioch who was apparently more trusted than Paul. But at any rate, Paul and Barnabas began their missions together. Ultimately, Paul broke with Barnabas and with Antioch, and the break seems to be over a relatively important factor. In fact, it is maybe the most important factor in Paul's life. Paul comes to believe that you don't need to be a Jew to be a Christian. Up until that time, and we're talking now about the roughly the 50s, not 1950s, the 50s, the belief among Christians was that one needed to be a good Jew to be a Christian. Paul apparently was a very, very practical person. And since he was out in the wilderness among pantheists, none of whom were Jews, or very few of whom were Jews, he began to ask himself, do I really need to convert these people to Judaism before I start teaching them about Jesus of Nazareth? And Paul, of course, concludes that he doesn't have to do so. This has a couple of fairly practical and incredibly important factors associated with it, which we don't think of as being really all that critical at this day and age, but apparently it was then. Of course, it was relatively easy to convert to Judaism at the time. We've got lots of material now that suggests that you could essentially convert to Judaism with a few weeks of study and then proclaiming yourself to be a Jew. But in order to do so, you had to commit to the Torah, which meant that you had to adhere to the Jewish dietary requirements, the Jewish requirements relating to cleanliness and washing, ritual washing, and perhaps most importantly, you had to be circumcised. And of course, converting an adult to Judaism with circumcision was a perilous and very, very difficult proposition. And Paul concluded that it was the critical barrier to the conversion of so many pagans to Christianity. And therefore, he concludes that it's not required. He brings that back to Antioch, and Antioch is enraged because they are good Jews as well as Christians. And they say, no, that cannot possibly be the case. And so Paul says, I'm going to Jerusalem to get a ruling on this. And we have some pretty good documentation right now that in 56 AD, Paul traveled to Jerusalem with Barnabas. Apparently, the people in Antioch didn't trust that Paul would bring back the correct response from Jerusalem when he returned. And so they sent Barnabas as his minder, so to speak. And Paul tells us, and we also read in the Acts of the Apostles, that he met with the three men he refers to as the pillars of the church, James, John, and Peter. We'll remember, of course, that James is referred to in both the letters and in the Acts as the brother of Jesus, quite likely his older brother. And apparently he had moved into a position of leadership after the crucifixion and resurrection. John is referred to as the beloved of Jesus, his closest friend among the apostles. And of course, Peter is the one to whom Jesus had given the keys. And these three men were considered to be the leaders of the Jerusalem community. Paul makes his case to the three of them. And according to Paul and Luke in the Acts of the Apostles, they said, yes, we agree with you. You don't have to be a Jew to be a Christian. That was probably the single most important event in the first century history of Christianity, except for, say, the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth, because it immediately opened up Christianity to the entire Roman Empire, not just to the Jews. Of course, all of this was Paul subsequently builds up with a very, very sophisticated theology of the fact that Jesus died not just for the chosen people, but for all people. And his redemptive theology concepts become very, very universal rather than specific. We even begin to see modifications in the way the people are telling stories about Jesus before the Gospels were written down, where the language seems to change just a bit. And there are several passages in the Gospels we have today where Jesus makes it clear that he came not just for the Jews, but for all people. This was certainly the notion that Paul takes on. There were some detours in the concept of Christianity versus Judaism and the notion of circumcision over the next few years. It's apparently true that the Jerusalem community was not entirely sympathetic with the decision that had been made. It's described as being a decision of the pillars, the three. But there is a subsequent passage in the Acts of the Apostles where Peter and James seem to have an argument when the two of them are in Antioch over the same issue. That has led scholars to believe that maybe James was a dissenter and that the decision was made by John and Peter, not by James. But we just don't know that. It's not described in any detail in the Acts of the Apostles. So we have a situation where Paul is now moving around the Eastern Mediterranean, primarily Turkey, but also into the Balkans, and of course, into Greece. I say Greece last because it does not appear that Paul was very successful in creating churches in Greece, although the great exception to that was Corinth, which was really not considered part of Greece at that time. It was separate from the Greece at that time was essentially Athens, and there were other places where Paul was successful. He creates house churches, and now we begin to see the beginning of the Christian liturgy coming into play, I think. The liturgy seemed to occur in two parts. And this is going to sound very familiar to all of us. Of course, there were no gospels to read, no epistles to read. You could read parts of the Hebrew Bible if you had scrolls, but there was nothing written yet in the New Testament. And so stories were told. And we have a very, very good history of people who memorized stories and moved from community to community telling the stories related to the life of Jesus. And so we think the first part of the meeting was really like a social get-to-know-you kind of time when people would tell stories about Jesus and listen to stories and pray. That would have pretty much followed the style of a prayer service in a synagogue at that time. There would have been prayers, they would have read the Psalms, they would have read something from the Torah, maybe something from the Haftorah, and then departed. And so the first part of the Christian liturgy seemed to follow generally the concept of the Judaic liturgy of the time. The second part was, of course, quite different. And the Greeks, of course, had a notion of an agape meal, a meal of friendship. If someone arrived at your home, the Greek rules of hospitality, of course, required that you would offer them something to eat, something to drink, and you would give them an opportunity to rest before they continued on their journey. And this later became known as an agape meal or a neighborly meal and a meal of love in another way of saying it. The agape meal, Paul noted, was extremely close to the Last Supper. And that the meal that Jesus shared with his disciples in the upper room was not terribly different from the notion of meal hospitality in the Greco-Roman world. And so it seems that the second part of the liturgy became a meal of within community, a meal demonstrating neighborly love to those who were in the community. And frankly, that style of liturgy has persisted for close to 2,000 years. Later in the second century, and I don't have time to cover too much of that this morning, but it seems that some of the more conservative Christians wanted to bring back the notion of the sacrifice in the temple, which of course had been destroyed by the Romans in 70. And they wanted to convert the agape meal into not only a communion of friends, but a meal of sacrifice, a reenactment of the crucifixion. And they attempted to bring that back into place. There are many scholars today who suggest that the letter to the Hebrews, which seems to be pushing us in that direction, appeared just after the end of the first century and was an attempt by the more conservative Christians to reinstate the notion of the temple and the sacrifice. But certainly within Paul's house churches, the two-part liturgy of reading, study, and prayer, and then communion became the style of liturgy. And it was typically, therefore, hosted by the host of the home rather than an ordained priest or an ordained minister. Of course, we didn't have the notion of an ordained priest or minister at that time. All we had were the apostles and their successors who were deemed to be bishops. And there weren't enough of them to get around to all of these communities that were growing. Incidentally, it has been estimated that by the time that Paul died, which we think was right around 67, there were probably 50 to 60,000 Gentile Christians in the world. And by 100, there were probably more than 100,000 Gentile Christians in the world. They far outnumbered the number of Jewish Christians in the Christian church, maybe by a factor of 10 to 1. And of course, that set the course of history for Christianity. So what kind of conclusions can we draw from this? Okay. First, of course, is that Paul, inspired by the Spirit and ratified by the disciples in Jerusalem, in the Council of Jerusalem, concluded that you did not have to be a Jew before you became a Christian. A critical factor in the history of Christianity. That resulted in the rejection of many of the Jewish cultic ideas. And we began to see Christians trying to separate the moral notions of the Hebrew Bible from the cultic notions of the Hebrew Bible. And for the most part, those 700 plus rules in the Torah were lost to Christians. Christians, of course, never rejected the moral code contained in the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments, and then, of course, they began to emphasize the words of Jesus from Ecclesiastes relating to the law of the great commandment to love God and to love your neighbor. And Paul began to recognize that the liturgy his communities were celebrating essentially were the two parts of that great commandment. At the beginning, when we read and pray and praise God, we're dealing with the first part of the great commandment. And in the second part, where we are loving our neighbor, we are taking communion with them, recognizing our solidarity with them. And as a consequence, Paul begins to recognize, I think, that the Christian liturgy is the paradigm of the Great Commandment. And he emphasizes it appropriately in that regard. Of course, as I mentioned last week, within a few years after these churches began to be formed and the Gentiles came into significant majorities within the Christian communities, they began to ask themselves what their status was in the Roman Empire. And up to that point, they had the Romans, of course, had treated Jews and Christians as being identical. And in fact, when a lot of the literature that deals with persecution of Christians in the middle of the first century, right up through 100 and later, was really not just persecution of Christians. It was persecution of Christians and Jews, because the Jews in Palestine were troublemakers. And of course, the destruction of the temple in 70 was the epitome of that persecution. But by the end of this period, the Christians are beginning to think of themselves as non-Jews. And they begin to think about, how can we distinguish ourselves from the Jews, so that if the Romans persecute the Jews, or if they tolerate the Jews, they will also tolerate us. And so Christian thinkers, starting in the beginning of the second century, start to talk about being other than Jew. And unfortunately, for the history of Judeo-Christianity, they also began to form ideas that if Christians were going to be successful within the Roman Empire, they had to make friends of the Romans. And you don't make friends of the Romans by accusing them of crucifying your God. And so what did they do? They transferred it. And they started talking about the fact that the Jews had crucified Jesus, not the Romans. This was a way, essentially, of ingratiating themselves with the Romans. And we begin to see, by the beginning of the second century, some of the Christian theologians referring to the Jews as being guilty of deicide, of killing God. And that really has set the course of so much anti-Semitism over so many years. I'm going to put this together, hopefully, next week and see where we are at the end of the first century. But I hope you've gotten the feeling that, first of all, of what life was like during that period, what Jesus quite likely did in bringing about Christianity, and then how Paul, a few critical decisions made during Paul's lifetime, changed it all and set Christians and Jews against each other. And of course, as I mentioned last week, by the end of the first century, this was coming from both sides. Not only were the Christians accusing the Jews of deicide, but the Jews were accusing the Christians of being atheists or agnostics or blasphemers because they believed in more than one God. They were giving up Abraham's monotheism and therefore had given up the right to be the heirs of Abraham. So with that, I'll take your questions and then we'll go forward next week. Yes, sir. Around the end of the first century, it's generally believed that the population of the Roman Empire, which would have included the East and Western Mediterranean, North Africa, etc., was somewhere around 2.5 to 3 million. So if there were 100,000 Christians, they would have been a relatively small minority, I'm sorry. Yes. You know, it's whenever we talk about instances like that, it becomes very difficult because we, of course, as Christians, have faith and belief. Okay, it is clear that whatever happened to Paul, it changed his life. He, of course, describes it as being an injury, followed by a time of personal reflection, and then apparitions. Frankly, I don't see that there's all that much difference between an apparition in a dream and an apparition when you're alive, when you're awake. I tend to judge both of those by what the results are. And the results are clearly that he was a changed man after that period. And as Christians, we can believe that the Spirit was at work. And whether the Spirit works through an apparition in a dream or whether it works in a personal apparition while you're awake, it's nice to talk about, but it's sort of like talking about how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. We just don't know, but we can measure the consequences of what happened. And that was, he was a changed man. And then we can go from there as Christians and say, and yes, that change was so dramatic and so important to us as to the world that it's clear to us that the Spirit was at work. I hope that answers your question without ducking it too much. Yes. Well, we know that from about 50 years before the time of Christ until about 115, there were multiple multiple examples of when the Jews were essentially exiled from Israel. Even before that, of course, we had the Babylonian captivity, and before that, an Assyrian invasion. There's a long, long history of Jews living in diaspora outside of Israel. And many of those communities have thrived and flourished over the years. Many scholars today, for example, believe that there were more Jews in Alexandria at the time of Christ than there were in Jerusalem. And so there were very, very substantial diaspora communities. Certainly the community that Paul encountered in Antioch was a very large one. We don't know quite how large. They're doing some excavations of some of the buildings at this point, and a lot of the very early estimations that there were a few hundred are now being revised, and it's being suggested that maybe there were a few thousand Jews in Antioch at the time that Paul arrived. And so what we have is basically a history of a people who have for 2,000 years plus been in diaspora. You know, and the comment I made last week was from about 115 to 1945, there were almost no Jews in Israel. And as a consequence, Jews lived all over the world. You've probably all seen the statistic that there are more Jewish people living today in New York City than there are in either Tel Aviv or Jerusalem. That is true of many cities around the world. And so the Jews are a diaspora people. Of course, I guess we could also say there are more Christians living in New York than there are in Jerusalem or in Rome. But more questions? Thank you.